And it worked, right? It worked, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
Come in, come in.
I called the JS office. They said they will look into it and get back to us by email. Okay. And this Japan ambassador, he's away in.
Hi, V.
Hello. Good afternoon from Incheon. I am Fidelis Sadigon, Sustainable Development Officer with ESCAP East and Northeast Asia Office. We are about to start the East and Northeast Asia Policy Dialogue on the 2022 Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific, ESCAP's flagship publication. With our session this afternoon being recorded, we highly appreciate your support in keeping your camera off and mic muted for the non-speakers. Kindly post as well your queries and comments on today's discussions on the chat box. We will try to address them later during the interactive discussion. Thank you. Now, to open our policy dialogue, may I now give the floor to Mr. Gambold Basanjav, Head of ESCAP East and Northeast Asia Office, to deliver the opening remarks.
Dear participants, warm greetings from Incheon. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the East and Northeast Asia Policy Dialogue on the Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific 2022. This is the third year we are holding our virtual engagement on the survey, ESCAP's flagship publication. The theme of this year's survey, Building Forward Fairer Economic Policies for an Inclusive Recovery and Development, addresses the core issue of inequality, which has been made more accurate with the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have seen the disruptions of the COVID-19 pandemic across the board, most accurately felt by vulnerable sectors in our society. At this time, we have seen how countries have developed a broad range of policy responses, from health-related responses containing the spread of the virus to socio-economic responses assisting households and sectors hardly hit by the economic slowdown resulting from the pandemic. At this point, countries are taking the approach of coexisting with the COVID-19 and are continuing to gain a stronger foothold on post-pandemic recovery. Cognizant of the stark reality that an estimated 85 million people in the region have been pushed into extreme poverty since the pandemic, inequality remains a priority area to address. To this end, the recommendations from the 2022 survey of a three-pronged policy agenda to shape inclusive economic recovery in Asia and the Pacific provides a rich starting point of engagement in our policy dialogue today. The three-pronged policy agenda includes smart fiscal policies in terms of overall efficiency and impact, monetary policy geared towards promoting inclusive development, and structural reform policy generating more inclusive outcomes. The experiences of countries in our East and Northeast Asia sub-region could provide further context on how these policies could foster inclusive recovery and development. The 2022 Asia and the Pacific SDG Progress Report, another ESCAP flagship publication, highlighted that East and Northeast Asia is on track to achieve the SDG target towards no poverty, Goal 1. The sub-region is well ahead of schedule in reducing poverty in terms of the share of the population living below national and international poverty lines. To this end, it would be interesting to know more about countries' achievements in poverty reduction. For instance, for China on how policy reform related to agricultural and rural revitalization have helped address the inequality issue. In terms of monetary policy, it would be also interesting to have deeper understanding on the transmission channels of how monetary policy has reduced inequality in Asia-Pacific countries, including the Republic of Korea. In addition, while we recognize that countries take differentiated strategies and tailored approaches in line with national circumstances, there could be areas where potential for cooperation and collaboration could amplify national efforts in building forward failure. On this note, together with all of you, I look forward to the next 1.5 hours exchanging perspectives on how economic policies could foster inclusive recovery and development. We appreciate your interest in our policy dialogue today, third year in the running. Thank you.
Thank you, Gumball. At this point, we are looking forward to all our presentations and to present the key messages and highlights of the 2022 Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific. We have our ESCAP colleague from the team who worked on the survey report, Ms. Lin Zhu. Lin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, we could see it.
All right, great. So just to help with the presentation, I will turn on my camera just to help with it. Thanks, Gamble, and thanks everyone for joining us today. This is our first sub-regional policy dialogue, and as a tradition, we run this policy dialogue with sub-regional officers to further disseminate the survey finding after the official launch. And we will also have similar policy dialogue in other sub-regions. Without further ado, let me convey our key message this year. So concerns about persisting inequality have come to the force in the aftermath of COVID-19 pandemic. Macroeconomic policy need to address this concern. Despite a reasonably strong economic rebound from the pandemic, people are left behind. This call for more attention to inclusive policy. The 2022 survey goes beyond traditional macroeconomic thinking and provide new insights on how macroeconomic and structural policy can tackle inequality. We call to spend smart and tax fair. We advocate inclusive central banking to go beyond inflation stability. And we also argue structural transformation is fundamental to reduce inequality. So let's have a look at the economic performance and the outlook. Asia Pacific region recovered strongly in 2020. And the rebound was supported by robust external demand and from the region's export, which have to increase trade and manufacturing activity in the service. And exports of electronic, semiconductor, machinery, and other consumer durable benefit from increased demand and manufacturing. Still, the level of output in 2021 is still approximately 2% below the pre-pandemic past. With new outbreak of the Delta variant of COVID-19 disrupt production and transport of goods, particularly of semiconductors, more evidence in the third quarter. This supply disruption halt electronics and automotive assembly line and weigh on exports, contributing to the global supply chain disruption. In China, economic activity began to moderate in the third quarter, triggered by regulatory tightenings on several sectors, including technology firm, education service provider, online finance, and property sectors, which weigh on sentiments and contribute to the moderation in the region's growth. As feared, the region is experiencing a K-shaped recovery, both within and between countries. between countries, different recovery trajectory, unequal vaccine access, and differences in stimulus measures are observed. Within the region, recovery has been also uneven across different sectors. The manufacturing sector has indeed benefited from the rising global demand, while we see that mobility restrictions and border closures had also have some impacts on the transport and hospitality sector. Despite improvement in both sectors, they have yet returned to the pre-pandemic level. Against this backdrop, inflation also edged up across the region in 2021, influenced by rising global food and fuel prices and pandemic-induced disruption. Within many developing Asia countries, currency depreciations also contribute to the inflation pressures. Core inflation also showed moderate increase in 2021, indicating that inflation may be becoming a more broad-based phenomenon. Pandemic-related expansionary fiscal and monetary response also affect inflation. Cash handout, wage subsidy, utility bill subsidy, among other fiscal response, increase household saving, while accommodative monetary policy and low borrowing costs also induce spending and investment, leading to increasing inflation. As a result, inflation surpassed central bank target in a number of countries in the regions. In response to rising inflation pressure, monetary policy has become less accommodative, with more central banks either having increased their policy interest rates or kept them unchanged in 2021 and 2022. In ENEA, core inflation and inflation are above target in Korea and Mongolia, and these two countries also raised their policy rate recently. Rising domestic housing rental and cost of service in Korea is also influencing the inflation dynamic. On the other hand, inflation is more subdued in Japan and Japan and China. Japan left the interest rate unchanged, and China reduced its reserve requirement ratio in early December 2021. Later in December, the central bank reduced its loan prime rates by 5 basis points for the first time since April 2022. And in January 20 this year, China further cut its one-year loan prime rate to 3.7%. The outlook for ENEA is riddled with uncertainty. Growth with ENEA countries are projected at 4.6% in 2022 and 4.3% in 2023, a more moderate pace compared with 2021 as the base effect disappears. The region's exports are likely to continue to support economic growth, but at a more moderate pace as demand from other regions start to decline. The full resumption of economic activity will be influenced by many factors, including the availability of vaccine, the stringency of restrictions, while labor market will take time to recover. In many parts of the region, except China, encouraging signs are taking shape in early 2022 as concern over the COVID virus are easing, and several countries are preparing to reopen their borders. The moderations in China's consumption, exports, and industrial activity will no doubt weigh on the region's growth momentum, given the interlinkage of China with other economies in the region. The Russian-Ukraine conflict will no doubt be another factor casting a shadow on sentiments and economic activity. And last but not least, risks of long-lasting scars and macroeconomic stabilities are rising. Hence, we recommend countries will need to adopt a policy mix to coexist with pandemics, one which strikes a balance between avoiding economic and social fallout by maintaining public health, livelihood, and lower burdens on health systems. And to avoid macroeconomic stability, we argue that fiscal policy need to remain accommodative to support the nation's recovery in the region. But within shrinking fiscal space, spending will have to be more targeted and efficient, while essential area of spending will need to be maintained. With rising inflation trend, monetary policy will remain accommodative only in countries where inflation is expected to remain within the target. On the other hand, for those countries where the inflation pressure has been high, a timely increase in the interest rate will also help with stemming potential capital outflows. As mentioned, our report suggests a three-step building forward fair policy agenda for post-pandemic inclusive recovery and development, which require a coordinated government action at all three fronts: physical, monetary, and structural. First, we will analyze the role of governments in reducing inequalities through physical policy. The role of physical policy in tackling inequality is well known. However, it's often tied with the misconception that the more spending equals more impact. But this is rarely the case. This chart will show that the total impacts of education expenditures on inequality reductions. So each dot represents a countries. It represents a countries, and the rectangle represent ESCAP, countries in ESCAP, members of ESCAP. As we can see that for country represented by the lowermost dot, we find that each 1% of the GDP spent on education reduce the total inequality by almost 1.5 Gini points out of 100. But if you look at the dot lying around the vertical axis, for that countries, expenditures on education has nearly zero impacts on inequality reduction. This means that education has an inequality reducing impact, but impact vary across country depending on the designs of the policy. The same go for health, and we see that the impacts of health expenditures vary across different countries, although it's mostly inequality reducing. And this is true for social transfers. As you can see in the third and fourth column, the third column is direct transfer and the fourth is indirect transfers. But if we look at the tax categories, such as direct tax in column 5 and value-added tax, the overall impact on reducing inequality is marginal. So what is clear from this chart is that despite varying outcomes of government expenditure, the impact is the greatest if we spend on education, health, and social protections. From this chart, the COVID-19 pandemic, we see the COVID-19 pandemic require government to spend more than they probably could, and we are also aware that they cannot continue spending. So physical expenditure, as you can see from the blue bar here, for ENA country has been much higher compared to the revenue collected, which is indicated by the red bar. So now, in order to make this gap, government have borrowed, which also lead to rising debt pressure, as indicated in the green line. But then there is also an expectations of fiscal consolidation, because we know that this fiscal deficit cannot be sustainable. So at some point, fiscal consolidation is expected. Historical evidence suggests that consolidation inevitably leads to rising inequality level. This has implications for future growth potential as it reduces output of uneven economies. And this is so we call for spending smart in our survey. What does spend smart mean? In the past, we have seen that in times of stress, expenditure in healthcare, education, and social protection get cut first. But as we also saw earlier, these are the areas with the largest impact with potential for inequality reductions and long-term growth. In spending smart, we argue that in times of crisis, these three areas should be the last one to get cut. And also, with limited physical space, we propose spending smart in the area which give government the bigger bang for the buck. This can be done through three ways. First is to by ensure universal health coverage, strengthen early age education for all, and provide universal basic social protections. Second, we also argue that countries should reduce wasteful and inefficient spending, eliminate socio-economic barriers at all levels of education, and improve efficiencies through digital technology. And in healthcare, this digital technology is also what country can consider to deploy to reduce inefficiency. And again, in the area of education, close the digital divide will provide more children opportunity and access to education, especially those children in the rural area. However, such a spending cannot be maintained without adequate revenue collections, as the government had depleted significantly over the past 2 years. ENA country generally, from this chart, we can see that ENA country generally perform better than the other developing countries in Asia and the Pacific, but we argue that more can be done to further increase the tax revenue, as we can also see from this chart that compared to OECD, which has almost 35% of tax revenue as a 35% of tax revenue as a percentage of GDP. China, Mongolia, and Korea, there is still room for them to improve their tax revenues. To increase tax revenue, we recommend 3 policy actions. First, government will need to broaden their commitments and strengthen public sector institutions to ensure that all pay their fair shares by ensuring that individual and company comply with existing regulations and closing the loophole in the system, fighting illicit financial flow. And second, government must work towards broadening their tax base through two areas. First, 2 approaches. First is to formalizing the business activity, and second is to consider expanding taxation to include the digital economy. The government must also shift the tax burden up from the lowest income household by first making corporate and personal tax more aggressive. In this way, fiscal policy can also help promote a more fair and inclusive development. We have talked about fiscal policy, and fiscal policies in the survey. We argue that fiscal policy is more a solution to address the symptom of inequality, and besides the also play an important role in addressing the root cause of the inequality through structural transformations. We have discussed the risk of widening inequality gap in the post-COVID recovery and potential fiscal measure to build forward better. However, redistributions through progressive taxes and transfer alone won't be adequate to solve the problems. From this chart, we can see that in advanced economies, taxes and transfers do play an important role in addressing the symptom of inequality, as indicated by the red column. The highlighted country here is Japan, in which tax and transfer do reduce inequality, while not as much when we compare to the other OECD countries on the far right. But in developing Asia Pacific countries, the roles of redistribution policy is still highly limited due to the narrow physical space and challenges with targeting. In some cases, taxes and transfer can even have a regressive effect, which means that they can increase inequality rather than reduce inequality. The highlighted three countries here are Korea, Mongolia, and China. And from we see that taxes and transfer actually don't really bring down inequality much. The experience of Asia and the Pacific between 1990 and 2019 also suggests that taxes and transfer didn't become much more effective in reducing inequality over time in developing countries of the region, as indicated in the red column. Even in advanced countries, although increase in tax and transfer result in greater reductions in income Gini, these changes were still inadequate to fully compensate the surge in market inequality before tax in this period. In contrast, most of the reduction in Gini in Asia and the Pacific was actually driven by fair market outcome before taxes and transfers kick in, as demonstrated in the circled countries. So this finding suggests that first, to build forward fairer policy efforts would also need to be proactively shape the structural and market forces that determine inequality level and trend in the first place. Second, even for fiscal policies, greater attention should be devoted to using taxes and spending to tilt such structural and market forces in favor of inclusive development. Economic structure transformation provide a unique lens for understanding inequality dynamic driven by structural and market forces. However, contemporary consensus suggests that trajectory is neither a deterministic path nor a universal road. Let's first look at Japan and Korea. They succeed in growing with inequities in the early stage, achieving rapid industrialization and economic growth, and at the same time maintain low and stable inequality. However, since the 1990s, this trend has been somewhat reversed. And in the case of China, China's economic growth and structural transformation since late 1970s share a number of commonality with Korea, but were accompanied by a more significant surge in inequality. And if we look back to these charts again, it actually implied 2 points. First, the implication of structural transformations on inequality is a complex process in which factors such as leading sectors in structural transformation, globalization, availability and access to economic opportunity and technology can all potentially affect the interactions between structural transformation and inequality dynamic. Second, national experience demonstrates significant diversity in the inequality development pathway. This implies that there is ample space for policy to play a role. The policy tip from the analysis of Asia-Pacific cases shows that growing with equity is possible, and this is achieved not only by the early Asian dragons and tigers in different episodes of the economic take-off, but also in recent example of poorer developing countries such as Bangladesh, Cambodia, Vietnam, and to a less extent Pakistan. However, such success need to be supported by with wise choice of sectoral strategy and conductive policy combinations. Our analysis showed that conductive factors for inclusive structural transformation include fast and sustained creations of productive jobs, universal access to primary and secondary education, equalized access to infrastructures and essential public services, and a fair starting point and rural development. And on the other hand, there are also factors that may hinder inclusive structural transformation, and we need to be mindful about that. That is employment concentrations in informal and low productivity sectors, use bulge, which mean not creating enough opportunity, and job market segmentations. So we argue that countries should take actions on three fronts for more equal market outcome. First, they should guide structural transformation towards a job-rich path by ensuring resources in appropriate sectors, And second, they should shape the income distribution outcome of the market by empowering labor and providing equal access to education. And lastly, they said they also need to manage the socioeconomic disruptions of technology revolutions by ensuring social protection and lifelong learning and vocational education opportunities. So far, we have talked about how government can shape inclusive society, but central banks are another important policy actors. Central banking for inclusive development is a relatively new area, and we highlight a few ways in the survey how central banking can support inclusive development. In fact, central bank in the region has already actively adopted measures to support financial inclusions, which is one dimension of inclusive development. For example, Bank of Korea refer to inclusive finance or development in their official documents, and all countries in the region are members of some global initiative on financial inclusion and education. For example, China is a member of Alliance for Financial Inclusion. Japan, Korea, and Mongolia are members of international networks on financial educations. In the report, we focus on 4 areas of central banking for inclusive development, and these correspond to central bank's role as monetary policymaker, official reserve manager, currency issuer, and lastly, financial regulators. While this may not be intention, a change in monetary policy direction can affect different people in different ways. For example, when interest rate is lower, borrower will be better off, but retiree who depends on interest income will be worse off. Of course, we don't deny that as monetary policy maker, the priority of central bank is to maintain inflation stability. But when the core mandate has been achieved, what else can central bank consider to? What else can central bank to do more to promote inclusive development? In the survey, we argue that they can better communicate the distributional impacts to the public, consider economic inequality when adjusting the policy rate, and allocate part of asset purchase to social bonds. On reserve management, it is common for central bank to prioritize safety and liquidity, but as reserves are considered more than adequate in many Asia-Pacific countries, we argue that reserve management with social gain in mind can be pursued. To do this, central bank can analyze how this shift will affect their portfolio performance, set up an investment committee that comprise external experts to make reserve allocation decision, and use part of the excess reserve to fund local social project. On central banking as currency issuers, about half of the central bank in the whole Asia Pacific region are already exploring central bank digital currency, or it can be called CBDC. So, for example, the Bank of Korea has recently set up a new unit to work on CBDC research and technology, and a task force to review the impact of CBDC issuance on its mandates. And the People's Bank of China has begun pilot testing for a retail CBDC known as Digital Yuan in 11 cities in late 2019. As financial regulator, we argue that central banks should not only promote financial stability, but also ensure enabling environment for innovative social finance. For example, central bank can develop and harmonize taxonomy for instruments such as social impact bond and sustainability linked bond. They can also provide some financial assistance to cover the high transaction costs issuing these bonds. In the case of China, People's Bank of China is working with the European Union to create a green investment taxonomy across the two markets, and the same can be considered to be developed for pro-social financial instruments. And in the case of social impact bond, Japan is a pioneer in using this financial instrument to channel private capital into social development and at the same time improve government service efficiency.
Lynn, if I may just interrupt, if we could already close the presentation. Okay,
Yes,
thank you.
So before I read, we only have one slide left. That is to conclude the central banking chapters. But I have introduced all the 4 roles that central bank can consider to expand their mandate and to take into account inclusive development. So we can go to the end of the presentations. Let me repeat that COVID-19 has provided us with a unique opportunity to embark on a much more fairer development path, and we can achieve fairer recovery by ensuring inclusion is at the centers of economic policy and focus on spending efficiency where impact is the maximum, spending on education, health, and social protections. We can also expand domestic revenue, shifting the burden away from low-income households. Government should target market outcome and promote job-rich transformations and empower the labor. We also argue that inclusive central banking is possible, and to achieve, looking through a new lens, central bank can play a key role in promoting inclusions. That's it. Thank you. Thank you. Lee, you can take over.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Lynn. So at this juncture, drawing attention to the Building Forward Fairer 3-pronged policy agenda highlighted in the survey report. In the next segment, we will have 3 presentations with perspectives from East and Northeast Asia sub-region to further contextualize how fiscal, monetary, and structural reform policies could foster inclusive recovery and development. To start off, we have Dr. Chuan Hong Zhang, who will present on China's policies for inclusive recovery and development. This is also taking sort of anchoring the presentation from what Lynn has mentioned earlier in terms of one of the factors for conducive factors for um, inclusive structural transformation is a focus on rural development. So that is something perhaps Dr. Zhang could share with us. Dr. Zhang is Associate Professor at College of Humanities and Development Studies and Director of Center for International Development Cooperation Studies at the College of International Development and Global Agriculture of China Agricultural University. Dr. Zhang also serves as the Secretary of China International Development Research Network, one of our long-standing partners in our joint work on the Annual Development Cooperation Forum, which we have in the region. So Dr. Zhang, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Faye, for your kind introduction, and thank you for providing me with this very good opportunity to share China's experiences in inclusive development with you. I'm quite impressed by Lin Zhe's presentation. You know, I have to comment that this is the very comprehensive and professional survey report, and most of the policies, I agree with most of the policies recommendations raised here. And so far, I think this is a really relevant report and give us quite a lot of implications on build forward fairer. That's also the objective of this conference. And Yushi, could you please help me to move to next? Yeah, today I'm going to focus on China's experiences for inclusive recovery and development, as mentioned by Faye during the introduction. You know, the structural transformation actually is key to eliminate structural obstacles for equality. And as a scholar who's been doing research and practice in China's poverty reduction and rural development, so today I will just share the experiences of China's poverty reduction and rural revitalization strategies, and touched upon a little bit on the coping strategies during this COVID-19 pandemic, and draw a little bit about lessons we learned. Next slide, please. Yeah, as we all know, you know, China has made great achievement in poverty reduction. Yeah, by the end of 2020, actually, we achieved the target of zero poverty. And in the last 8 years, particularly, almost 100 million people were lifted out of absolute poverty. Next slide. And at the same time, we can see China's poverty line has been increasing since 1979. Yeah, it was increased particularly in last 5 years from 298 yuan to 10,740 yuan. That's the per capita income. Of course, if we look at the new China's poverty line, it's more than 4,000 yuan. And besides these numerical standards, you know, we also use other criteria to measure our poverty. That include, we usually see 2 no worries, 3 guarantees. That means rural people are free from worries over food and clothing, and have access to compulsory education, basic medical services, and safe housing. By the end of 2020, that means all people in China have been these kind of has been reached this type of criteria. Next slide, please. And you know, how China make it, if we think from the whole story, we think, you know, agriculture and rural development policies play key roles. First, since 2004, 19 number 1 central documents have been issued by central government to support agriculture and rural development. Yeah, these you can see very clear from the China's structural transformation by emphasizing from income growth of farmers to infrastructure and public service to modernization of agriculture, and now comes to the rural revitalization strategies. Next slide. Yeah, we can see the list of these 19 number one central documents from 2004 to 2022. Next slide, please. And since, in the last 8 years, the rapid progress has been achieved for this poverty reduction. So due to the time limit, I just focus on the targeted poverty elevation strategies. This is a very important one. It was a strategy we see launched in 2012. And back then, President Xi said by 2020, all rural residents living below the current poverty line will be eliminated out of poverty. And also, since 2012, 1.6 trillion RMB, about $660 billion from central government were used for poverty elevation. Other financial flows, including loans and aid funds, were more than 13 trillion RMB. This is only includes the funds from the central government. Local government also contributes a lot. And besides this, we see strong institutional support is very important. This includes accountability system, coordinated by central government, responsible for provincial government, implemented by state and county level government, and also policy system. Besides those number one central documents, more than 230 documents were released during this period just to focus on China's poverty reduction. And of course, input system, social funds for poverty reduction increased by 20%. And of course, there are some social mobilization system. We have hand-in-hand movement, East-West collaboration. That means people, enterprises, and government from the developed Eastern region provide support. Either financial support, physical support, or human resource support, technology support to the less developed Western regions. And there are some multi-channel all-around supervision system, including inspection to participation of other democratic parties to supervise the progress and the better utilization of the financial funds. And there is strict assessment system. We have peer review system like intra-provincial assessment, third-party assessment, and media unannounced visit, etc. That is really strict for this assessment system. Next slide, please. And besides, the most important one, how can we target the poor people? How can we identify the poor people? China established a registration in database system. All the info of poor households were registered in the database system to ensure the accurate target and transparency. And the procedure of registration is very clear. First applied by the poor household, reviewed by the villagers group leaders, and then cross-checked by the information office at the county level. And also, not only information office, it's cross-check by different departments at the county level, and then decided by vote at the villagers congress, and checked by the township poverty elevation office, at last double-checked by the county level property elevation office to ensure the funds goes to the right person, right households. Next slide. And there are very specific trajectories, and we can see goals. Usually we call it the 5 batches policies, including industrial development, relocation, eco-compensation, education and training, and social security. That means we use different methods to target people caused by different reasons. And also there are 6 precisions targeted by to target the right person, allocate appropriate projects, accurate use of fund, tailor-made measures for households, dispatch the right officials to villages to achieve the desirable effects and results. Next slide. So these are the pictures I took from the field. We can see industries in poverty-stricken areas, the one in the middle and the one at the upper right, lower right is the community poverty reduction factories in the relocated areas in Guangxi province. Next slide, please. Yeah, and the last measure I have to mention is human resource insertion. You know, each poverty-stricken village can receive work team from different levels of government bureaus, agencies, altogether, 255,000 work team, 2 million town level officials, average 3 officials stay in one village for 2-3 years. And they also dispatch more than 3 million village first secretary. That means the local cadres have to go to the villages to help the local people. And of course, for CPC members, they not only function in policy making, in actions, they also need to take actions. During the last 8 years, 1,800 CPC members lost their lives. And also during this period of time, many enterprises participated in training village CEOs, chief executive officers, to fill the gap of local elites, lack of local elites. Next slide, please. And that's the past strategies after we achieved the zero poverty at the end of 2020. Chinese government also made new rural revitalization strategies, which we first released at the 19th People's Congress. And this strategy also prioritized the issue related to agriculture, rural area, and farmers. And it's very similar to targeted poverty reduction strategies. It has very concrete objectives like including industrial prosperity, livable environment, rural civilization, effective governance, and common prosperity. And the strategic planning, like action plan, was formulated and passed in 2018 with detailed timeline and specific trajectories. And if we look at this strategy, actually is the continuation of poverty reduction strategies focusing on rural development to eliminate the structural barrier of rural-urban inequality. And these also, to release China's potential and to get the new growth point, I think, of course, it's stated very clearly we need to have 5-year transition period to consolidate the poverty reduction achievements. That has also been included in these rural revitalization strategies. Next slide, please. And the next issue is, the coping strategies against the COVID-19 pandemic. And other uncertainties. If we look forward, we see in February 2022, China released another #1 central document it set the grain output target for 2022 at 650 million tons, and also hold the red line of 1 billion mu of arable land, and aims to build 100 million mu of high standard farmlands, and also says an absolute no to massive return of poverty, and also to boost e-commerce, tourism, and logistics. From this, we can see stability is the key to a stable development. As mentioned by Lin Zhuo, safety and stability actually is the key during the crisis period. And more recently, a new guidelines on promoting new urbanization with a focus on counties and towns. These including localization strategies for rural urban migrant workers, education, medical service, housing, etc., narrowing the gap of public goods and social service provision between rural and urban areas, and promote smooth domestic circulation through coordinating development of different regions and overcoming the obstacles faced by less developed areas. Yet the overall objective from these policies we can see is to seek new economic growth points by promoting the development of less developed areas. Next slide. And of course, if we say from this, we see that the impact of targeted poverty strategy is very impressive, just like the ban on the on-down movement in Korea, in South Korea. We see that targeted strategies has been spilled over to other areas, like this kind of zero COVID strategy. It's very controversial strategy right now, but so far, if we think about the whole world experiences and the Chinese experiences, we all agree this is the most appropriate strategy at present. China cannot sacrifice the large scale of deaths. And if we look at our previous experiences, usually we can control the COVID within 2 or 3 months. So this is the most efficient one if we see the previous experiences and control it while it is still controllable. Maybe in the future this strategy will change. And just yesterday we can see Shanghai has already resumed to work on the production. This is a good sign. And different from the increase in tax revenue, we can see China's policies is very different from most developed countries. We focus very much to tax reduction to small and medium enterprises. And we really emphasize the direct financial support from the central government to the grassroots level, small and medium enterprises. And Chinese Premier Li Keqiang has ever said, it's like a pour water for fish to make the fish grow. China rarely use monetary policy like a cash transfer to achieve to increase the consumption level. We think inflation is a really bad thing. Only hurt the poorest people. And of course, China has established the largest social protection system. More than 500 million people has received the basic pension insurance program, and also large-scale physical support from the central government to the local. This is the plan for 2022, 9.8 trillion, increased by 18% compared to last year. Next slide, please.
If I may interrupt, Dr. Zhang.
That's the last one.
Thank you.
You can see the lessons learned. Many scholars just draw 5 Ds of Chinese lessons. We can see determined leadership, detailed blueprint, development-oriented, data-based governance, and decentralized or committed delivery. And I think that the last one, 1E, experiment-based decision-making, is very important. We see pilot projects plus experiments and model expression, then encourage local innovation, make its own recipes. Of course, there will always exist challenges between efficiency and fairness. That is universal dilemma faced by almost every country in the world. And I also have some slides to share with you about what I'm doing in rural Yunnan province. Yushi, can you please just use 1 minute to go through these pictures? The pictures we took last. That's the progress of the village. You can just go through it. Thank you very much. I just stop here. Yeah, we can see the change of the village in just half a year to see how efficient Chinese government is in in delivering these strategies. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zhang. It's always a pleasure hearing from you and seeing your presentation. Now we move to our next speaker. Lynn, in her presentation earlier on the survey highlights, ended with the role of central bank. So for our next presentation, Dr. Seung Chuli will share his insights on inequality and monetary policy. Dr. Lee is an economist at macroeconomics team of the Economic Research Institute of Bank of Korea. Before taking his current position, he has served as economist for Research Department, Financial Market Department, and Economic Statistics Department in the Bank of Korea, and also for the Department of International Economic Affairs with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Dr. Lee, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fee, for introducing me, and thank you very much, Dr. Zhang, for sharing valuable experience of China with us. Could you show my PowerPoint, or should I share my?
You are able to share your presentation from your side. Could
Yeah.
we try that first, if that is okay?
Sorry, it's the one.
Yes. Yes, we could see your presentation now.
Yeah. Okay, hello, I'm Seung Chuli from Bank of Korea. I'm happy to talk about the inequality and monetary policy, which relates to the Chapter 4 of the Economy and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific 2020 to today. First of all, monetary policy issue is less frequently discussed in the context of inequality compared to fiscal policy. From the traditional view, many people have thought monetary policy is neutral to economic inequality in the long run. In addition, inequality has been regarded as a result of long-term structural changes such as automation, the digital economy, and globalization. However, people start to think central banks are not neutral to inequality problems anymore after the global financial crisis. This is because unconventional monetary policy, such as quantitative easing, is beneficial, especially for the rich, since they have much more long-term financial assets. Since then, many researches have been conducted on the issue of inequality and monetary policy more seriously. As I understand, there is no clear consensus about this issue. Actually, the results are quite different depending on the countries, periods, or policy environment. In the survey, the following 4 areas are covered. However, we will cover only the first area, the monetary policy conduct, today due to the time limit. As you know, the first priority of the most central banks today is price stability. But as I told you just before, income and wealth inequality problems have become one of central bank concerns, especially after the financial crisis. And many studies have researched the relationship between inequality and monetary policy since then. Monetary policy has effects on income and wealth inequality through various channels. For example, a conventional monetary policy such as changes of policy interest rate affects many economic variables like GDP, inflation, employment, and asset prices, which induce changes of income and wealth inequality. If a drop in policy interest rate brings about better employment and larger economic growth, then income inequality can be improved. This is because labor incomes are a major income source of the poor, thus they get more benefits from better labor market situation. On the other hand, if stock or house prices go up due to the monetary easing, then wealth inequality can be worsened, since rich people have more financial assets or real estate. However, we cannot naively conclude that monetary policy easing may reduce income inequality while deteriorate wealth inequality based on the previous possibilities. An expansionary monetary policy, which has more positive effect on high-skilled labor market rather than low-skilled industry, may deteriorate even income inequality. In addition, the income inequality can be even worse if the monetary policy easing may induce a large inflation or deteriorate purchasing power of poor people. Yes, it's very confusing to understand the effect of monetary policy on income and wealth inequality. The effects are different depending on countries, periods, or initial state of the economy. These figures also shows the various previous difficulties in finding the effect of monetary policy on inequalities. You can find this figure on the chapter 4 of the survey. With respect to the wealth inequality, more than half studies find a negligible effect of monetary policy. In addition, the same number of studies assert that monetary policy can increase or decrease inequality. With respect to income inequality, more studies claims that monetary policy is able to increase inequalities, but there are similar number of studies assert the other way around, while a significant number of studies also say there are only negligible effect. However, we can say more about the effect of monetary policy if we focus on a specific direction of monetary policy. Let's focus on one direction of policy interest rate rather than whole changes of monetary policy and its effect on income, and let's focus on its effect on income inequality only. In this case, we can find more evidences on positive effects of monetary policy on income inequality. As you know, monetary policy easing usually boosts the economy, which may increase employment opportunity of the poor especially. The recent study by Ponzi says this case also holds in Asia Pacific economies. We can find another similar result by Youssef et al., which asserts that a higher interest rate can aggravate the income inequality in Asia countries, including India, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Philippines. Let me talk a little bit about the inequality and monetary policy in Korea. We have a study that produces a similar result with respect to the effect of monetary policy easing on income inequality. This study says the lower interest rate reduces income inequality if we analyze the relationship based on the data from 1990s. However, we also find that the relationship has become rather unclearer after 2000, partly due to crises such as financial crisis and COVID-19, which resulted in larger income inequality, as well as inevitable drops of policy rates by the central bank, and the change of labor market situation that shows a weaker relation between monetary policy easing and better employment. In this study, we can see the result that a higher interest rate decreases wealth inequality by lowering prices of stock and especially real estate in Korea. As you know, the richer people have more asset like stocks and real estates, so the higher interest rate have an effect on decreasing the income inequality, wealth inequality in Korea. Let me wrap up my brief talk about inequality and monetary policy today. It is traditionally said that monetary policy can promote equality indirectly by maintaining low inflation and economic stability. As you know, volatile inflation usually weakens the purchasing power of the poor in general. These days, many people start to ask that a central bank should conduct more inequality-mindful monetary policy after the financial crisis. In response to this demand, central banks should develop a deeper understanding of distributional impact of monetary policy. As we've seen today, the research on the relationship between inequality and the monetary policy is still unclear. Therefore, central bank's monetary policy impact assessment may include the change of income and wealth distribution in a regular basis. Last but not least, central banks should have balanced stances between other goals like price or financial stability, maximum employment, and inequality. In other words, every central bank should consider an order of priority among these goals, including inequality, depending on a specific situation of an economy. Okay, this is the end of my short talk today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee, for your presentation. And now we move to the next presentation. We will have Dr. Masahiro Kawaii. Dr. Kawaii is the Representative Director of the Economic Research Institute for Northeast Asia, ERINA. He is also Professor Emeritus of the University of Tokyo and serves as a counselor of the Bank of Japan, a Senior Fellow of the Policy Research Institute of Japan's Finance Ministry, and a Distinguished Research Fellow of the Japan Forum on International Relations. Dr. Kawaii also served as Chief Economist for the World Bank's East Asia and Pacific region, Deputy Vice Minister of Finance for International Affairs and President of the Policy Research Institute of Japan's Ministry of Finance, as well as Dean and CEO of the Asian Development Bank Institute. We look forward to your presentation. Dr. Kawaii, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sadigon, for your kind introduction. I am very happy to be here to make my comments on the Economic and Social Survey of 2022. Let me share my PowerPoint. Okay. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we could see it, Dr. Kawaii.
Okay. All right. Okay. I have only 6 slides. So I don't think I'm going to spend more than 10 minutes. First of all, this Economic and Social Survey 2022 is a very well done survey that contains a very useful set of information as well as some challenging arguments. very useful information like the impact of education, health, and social protection spending on Gini coefficients, as was explained earlier, on the importance of pre-distribution or market income versus redistribution income in measuring income inequality. And also a new look at the Kuznets curve. And also the report has a very short section, but there is a statement on the impact of Russia and Ukraine's economy on Asia Pacific economies, and some challenging arguments on the role of central banks in promoting inclusive development, which was also commented on by Dr. Lee. Now, I want to make some comments on Economic and Social Survey 2022. Very useful approach focusing on fiscal policy, monetary policy, and structural policy. I have several kind of points I want to raise. First, on inclusive fiscal policies part. There was not much discussion on green spending, which is vital to not only sustainable economic development, but also inclusive economic development, because climate change does have a greater impact on poor and socially vulnerable people. So I thought the discussion could have picked up this green spending issue in a more prominent way. On tax part, there was a figure that compares OECD country situations with the Asia Pacific region in terms of the composition of tax revenue or government revenue. And that comparison would suggest that Asian developing countries would need to expand personal income tax and social security contributions. And also, in addition, maybe this is time for policymakers in Asia Pacific, particularly those in developing economies in the Asia Pacific region. They should consider introducing inheritance tax and real estate tax, not only for the purpose of collecting more tax revenues, but also for inclusive development. Now, central banks' role in promoting inclusive development, still there's a lack of sufficient evidence, as pointed out by Dr. Lee, on the effect of monetary policy on income and wealth distribution. And also, the report talks about foreign exchange reserve management. Not all central banks manage foreign exchange reserves. In the case of Japan, finance ministry manages foreign exchange reserves. And it was not clear in the discussion whether central banks themselves should manage foreign exchange reserves or an entity separate from central banks like a sovereign wealth fund should manage foreign exchange reserves. And also there was a reference to central bank digital currency promoting financial inclusion. It's correct to say that central bank digital currency can promote financial inclusion for the purpose of payment settlements, but not for other financial services like loans or insurance and other financial services which people who are excluded from the formal financial sector would need most. Now, on structural transformation for inclusive development, there was a point which said that there's a need to keep the pace of technological development at a more manageable pace. And it was not clear what this meant. There's a question whether the government can really do this, or if the government does this, there may be a negative impact on the economy. Perhaps a better policy would be to encourage the private sector to adapt to the pace of technological development, which can be rapid. And those countries which are aging fast and face labor shortages would need a rapid technological adoption, particularly in the area of digital, robotic, AI technologies. Central banks' role in promoting inclusive development was extensively discussed by Dr. Lee. There was a table in the report that explains central banks' statements or strategies or objectives with regards to promoting inclusive finance or inclusive development. The question is how to translate these statements into action. And some central banks are promoting financial inclusion policies, such as requiring commercial banks to channel a certain fraction of their loans to SMEs. But beyond this, what sort of policies would be effective is not very clear. More evidence would be needed, but starting this kind of discussion, I think, is very useful. Now, I want to point out three risks, major risks to economic recovery, which were mentioned, but more attention would be needed, particularly after the Russia-Ukraine war and also the development in China. First is the rising interest rate in the United States that is faster in pace than has been expected. The inflation is rising globally, not only in the United States, because of the rise in energy prices, food prices, and other resource prices. And the US inflation rate is getting very high. So it's very understandable for the US to adopt monetary policy tightening. But the consequence of this for emerging economies needs to be taken up more in a more prominent way. If emerging economies do nothing, they may face higher inflation through currency depreciation against the dollar, as they also face rising prices of resources and commodities, or they may face the risk of rapid capital outflows and even currency and financial crisis, particularly in those countries with high external debt. On the other hand, if these emerging economies tighten monetary policy also, they may be able to control inflation to some extent, but at the same time, they face the risk of economic slowdown or recession. So there is a more acute balancing act needed for many emerging economies. The second is China's slowdown that is taking place because of lockdowns in major cities induced by the zero COVID strategy or policy. zero COVID policy of China has been affecting the Chinese economy in a negative way and its exports and imports. And it can have also a negative impact on the Asian economies and the world economy. And this is posing the current risk to economic recovery. I would put this as a second largest risk after U.S. monetary policy tightening. And we know that one of the reasons for the zero COVID policy is because of China's very careful approach to manage health. But perhaps this is due to the low vaccination rates, particularly among old age people in China, and also because of the relative ineffectiveness of Chinese vaccines relative to those vaccines developed in the United States and Europe, and also the underdeveloped COVID treatment medicines to cope with the spread of infections. So this zero COVID policy of China is a result of is the result of the lack of or inadequate response to the spread of COVID. So to move from the zero COVID policy to the policy of coexisting with the pandemic, China has to redouble its efforts at improving the effectiveness of COVID vaccines and vaccination rates. And perhaps China might import foreign vaccines to improve the health of Chinese people so that economic reopening can be done and border reopening can be done and manufacture COVID treatment medicines. My third risk is the rapidly rising energy, food, and other resource prices, which have been aggravated by the Russia-Ukraine war. We know that these prices were rising even before the war, reflecting a combination of the strong recovery of demand for goods in advanced economies and inadequate supply capacities. And the Russia-Ukraine war has been disrupting not only energy and food supplies, but also logistics and distribution systems. And in addition, some food-producing countries have started to restrict exports of food to ensure their own food security. So this rising energy, particularly energy and food prices, are raising concerns for energy and food security for many import-dependent developing countries, posing threat particularly for poor and vulnerable people. So these three major issues could have been pointed out, but of course, the report was published in April, and many of these new developments are really new. So these are the current risks I want to put on the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kawai, and we thank all our speakers for this afternoon. Unfortunately, we don't have any time for questions, or perhaps if you could just indulge us, maybe we will have one round of questions for each for our speakers, just to further enrich our discussions. So if I may request our three speakers to turn on their camera for our interactive session. Appreciate as well a very brief and focused reply to our questions we have received from our participants. So perhaps I'll start with Dr. Zhang. China has no doubt created a miracle of lifting millions of people out from poverty, while the inequality has also picked up. So could you possibly elaborate what drove the structural shifts in China and under the Common Prosperity Agenda? Likewise, draw out what could this mean as well for other Asia Pacific countries?
Okay, thank you, Faye. This is a really fascinating question. It takes a long time to answer. I will try to be brief. I know time is very limited. If we think about the driving factors for the widening inequality from 1980s to 2014, actually, if you see the curve from 2014, China's inequality actually is been decreasing. So I think there are two major driving forces. The first one, I think, is China's integration into the globalization process. We know China used to be the largest, the poor and equal country, a closed economy. But since the end of 1970s, China gradually integrated into this globalization process. I'm not saying, this is a bad thing. Actually, China really benefits from this globalization process. And also this has driven China to change our domestic policy, like, we need to open up, and we need to change our mentality from socialism to a socialist market economy. We say if we want to we want to distribute the cake, first we need to make the cake larger, right? So that's really important. And I just stop here. It needs to be elaborated about China's domestic strategies on this. But if we think about common prosperity strategy, that's the quite new thing. There are 4 points I want to make it clear. The first one, I think it is clearly written in the documents, is not rob the rich to feed the poor. So that means we are going to stick to the market-driven policies and to continue this kind of market efficiency, but we need to regulate the effects of some capitalists, especially some monopolies, some non-appropriate competitions, all these. This is the first thing, it's not just to rob the rich to feed the poor. And the second, I think if we think the common prosperity is government initiative, the large-scale infrastructure investment will go to infrastructure and also social public service provision. That is the second thing. That means government resources will be targeted more to the less developed countries and vulnerable groups. And the third thing, I think, this is to avoid the welfare trap. As I mentioned, to China try to avoid something like the welfare states. It will lead China to go to something like middle income countries trap. So that means China is not going to imitate the policies of the high welfare states used before. And the last one, is to largely mobilize the social participation to create the third sector, to encourage especially the private companies to shoulder more social responsibility and contribute to social equity and a common prosperity. If we think about the implications for other neighboring countries, I think the first, I strongly believe there exists some path dependence for development. That means we need to follow a certain type of development trajectories. And the poverty, the equality based on poverty actually is like a castle in the air. It's not sustainable. First, we need to make the cake larger. And of course, we sacrificed a lot for China, like environmental degradation. And if we think that the current technological development, we can overcome this kind of bad effect. And the second thing, I think development without equality is not sustainable and inclusive. It may cause social conflict and affect the health and sustainable development. So that's the two lessons I think other countries can learn from China's experiences. Thank you, Fei.
Thank you, Dr. Zhang. And may I move quickly to Dr. Lee at this point where there's high inflation, you have volatile capital flows, so central banks are really busy addressing these problems. Those things in the background, could you possibly share your thoughts briefly for other countries in the region? What are the first steps in achieving inclusive central banking? Although at this point, with central banks busy with all these risks, as pointed out by Dr. Kawaii earlier. So your thoughts, please.
Yeah, actually, it's very hard for a central bank to think about inequality because central bank have other important goals like price or financial stability. Anyway, actually, the consideration for the inequality from the monetary policy side has not been a center of interest of the policymakers, even academics in Korea until recently. However, I believe that the Bank of Korea has played important role in promoting inclusive development in Korea. As you know, rich people are well self-insured against adverse shocks such as unemployment shocks, whereas poor people are quite vulnerable to them, right? Furthermore, the purchasing power of people can be easily reduced by high inflation. The Bank of Korea has pursued the economic and price stability by proper implementation of monetary policy, especially in crises such as the Great Recession and COVID-19. Although the Bank of Korea has pursued an inclusive development by conventional monetary policy, I think that we can do more for the economic equality, such as trying to understanding deeper relation between inequality and monetary policy, and considering reduction in inequality as an official goal in the future. But, you know, we may need a lot of time and researches in order to do it, right? With respect to the first step in achieving inclusive central banking in emerging countries, I think that focusing on the fundamental role of the central bank, such as pursuing price stability, should be #1 priority. Lastly, I like to stress that the importance of education, financial literacy for poor people in a pursuit of better economic equality in those countries. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. And perhaps to close it, Dr. Kawai, would you like to also weigh in on that question? Also considering your experience with the Bank of Japan. And if I may add another layer to it, in the context of your experiences with international organizations, do you see any role of collaborations across countries to somehow amplify these national efforts to build forward fairer?
Sure. International cooperation is very important at the global level, like the G20 level. It was very unfortunate that the G20 was divided in the last time when they got together, finance ministers and central bank governors. But global cooperation is very important. Cooperation at the Asia-Pacific region is important. Cooperation at the East and Northeast Asia region, particularly China, Japan, and Korea, trilateral cooperation is extremely important. New president has come in Korea, and Japanese Prime Minister came in last year. and they have not gotten together for some time. They need to discuss a lot of issues. They can focus on economic issues, trade issues. It's very important not to restrict international trade. It's very important for these countries to agree on how to open up the border for cross-border crossing of people. They need to exchange views on macroeconomic situations and monetary and fiscal policy directions. Although I don't think they would discuss how to reduce inequality so that monetary and fiscal policy would be used. This is something that we need to continue to discuss. Fiscal policy has a place to address inequality. Now, monetary policy is going to be very difficult. Dr. Lee has just said the Bank of Korea may put reducing inequality as one of the objectives of the Bank of Korea. But by doing so, maybe the Parliament or Congress may make various comments on monetary policy when policies affecting the poor people in a negative way, even though the overall economic impact can be judged as positive, therefore ultimately good for the poor. So this is a very interesting issue, but this is a kind of area where economists need to pay more attention to. Anyway, international cooperation is very important, and the Asian region has to really manage the rising global interest rates. This is a very important issue, and rising energy and food prices. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kawaii. And again, thank you to our speakers as well as our participants for engaging with us in the last couple of hours. So on this note, we have come to the end of our policy dialogue. We appreciate everyone's support. Just a quick note that all presentations as well as the recording will be posted on the events page. And we hope that you could also provide your comments through the evaluation survey we've shared in the chat box, which we will also be sending out to those registered participants. And on that note, we hope that the key messages and analysis of the Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific 2022 fuels further discussions and perhaps collective actions to speed up our post-pandemic economic recovery through building forward fairer. On that note, thank you very much for your support to everyone, and let's keep in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.